Good morning, everyone, again. Thank you for joining us. Again, I would request people who are joining in now to keep yourself on mute and with your video on off mode so that we can progress seamlessly. I'm Sapna, and on behalf of Bangaloreans for Bannerghatta, I welcome you to this fourth edition of our webinar series, Know Your Bannerghatta. Bangaloreans for Bannerghatta, as many of you may know by now, is a collective of individuals and institutions who came together to look into the conservation concern around the Bangalore Bannerghatta landscape through education, research, awareness, outreach. And Know Your Bannerghatta webinar series is an attempt in that direction. We are organizing about 8 sessions in this webinar series by inviting guest speakers from various organizations which have been working towards addressing the challenges that Bannerghatta area faces because it's one of the very few national parks which is set so close to a metropolitan city. We have had the honor of having with us Mr. Joseph Hoover, the convener of UCM, United Conservation Movement. Then we had with us Mr. Bhanu Prakash Ravilu, the coordinator of Bannerghatta Nature Conservation Trust. And last Sunday, we had with us Dr. Arun. He is the director of research and veterinary operations at Wildlife SOS. Today, we have with us in our fourth session, Ms. Sagarika Falke, a researcher focusing on human captive elephant interactions at the University of Hong Kong. Sagarika is presently pursuing her PhD at the University of Hong Kong in the above mentioned subject. She also did her MSc in psychology, human-animal interaction at University of Stirling, UK, and she also has a master in psychological counseling from Bangalore. She began her research career at Bannerghatta National Park, working on projects which focus on captive elephant welfare and human-elephant conflict with Erosha, India, where she worked as a program officer. When I asked her why she chose to work with elephants, she said, because they're fascinating animals. And the more I learn about them, the less I feel I know about them. This makes me want to study them further. There are so many things about their interactions with humans, their intelligence, and their individual personalities that make them delightful subjects. By sharing this space with them as fellow beings, I believe they have a lot to teach us humans about how we need to function as an ecocentric society. How beautifully said, Sagarika. Truly, we have so much to learn from each of our fellow living beings. Let us hear directly from Sagarika what elephants want, where she will be using Bannerghatta Biological Park as a model to understand how we could attempt to provide good welfare conditions for elephants in captivity. Before I welcome Sagarika, just a few notes to make. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. You can send your question via chat or you can ask directly. There are also some trivia questions that will pop up now and then during the presentation. Do see if you can answer them. Thank you. Over to you, Sagarika.
Thank you so much, Sapna, for that introduction. Just to check if everyone can hear me properly and can see my screen. Yeah. Once again, thank you, Sapna, for inviting me here to speak at B4B. And since we've had such august company in the past, it feels quite a proud moment for me to be able to share that space with them. I would also like to commend B4B on this initiative because I think, like what Sapna was saying, Bannerghatta is such a beautiful and unique landscape. Because it's very rare that we find, a forest which has such a rich biodiversity with elephants and wild tiger and a leopard so close to a metropolitan city and actually coming within the jurisdiction of Bangalore, which is a metropolitan city. So in that sense, Bannerghatta is a very sort of unique landscape, and it's something that's very close to my heart, and it's great that I'm here to be able to speak about it today. So my topic is what do elephants want, and this was the first project that I actually worked on when I joined Erosha, India, which was to look at the welfare of elephants in human care using the extensive systems of management. Now, before I get into the crux of my presentation, I wanted to ask you as an audience, do you feel that elephants that are in human care are captive or are they domesticated? Um, Now, the reason why I ask this is because elephants have technically been in human care since 2500 BC, which means that for about 4,000 years, Indians or the Indians in the Indian subcontinent, we've been using elephants for different purposes, right from the Indus Valley civilization. And why are these definitions important? And I will tell you about that in a moment. So, but just for the sake of it, to understand it from the perspective of the definition, um, elephants in captivity are in a situation where the person or animal is kept somewhere and is not allowed to leave. And the domestication is a process of bringing animals or plants under human control in order to provide food, power, or company. So these definitions become important, especially in the context of how we then treat the animals. Now, Wildlife Protection Act recognizes that elephants in human use are considered both a captive animal as well as a wild animal. And going back in terms of how we look at their welfare, I would, strongly recommend that elephants in human care are treated as captive in the sense that they are not domesticated. Sorry. So, according to AJ Ferrier, he's, has put it very succinctly, where he said that elephants are probably the only animals that have been employed by man and have never been bred selectively compared to, let's say, for example, dogs or cattle or cats who, had certain traits or characteristics genetically modified for, for human use. But in the sense, when it comes to elephants, for all purposes and intents, they are still wild animals because their population has always been extracted from the wild. They have never genetically been bred in captivity, and therefore they should receive greater consideration than mere domestic animals. So this definition actually becomes very important when it comes to looking at their welfare in captivity, where we don't treat them as domesticated animals because they're not. They are still essentially wild animals, and therefore when we're looking at their welfare, we need to look at it from the context of them being wild animals. Just to sort of give you a background of the current systems of management in which elephants are sort of maintained in Asia and in India, we predominantly have two systems, which is the extensive system of management and the intensive system of management. Now, the extensive system is where elephants are kept in natural or semi-natural environments, which means that they are usually kept in a forested landscape and they have access to natural food, vegetation, water, etc. They are also allowed to move to, some restricted areas, using restricted movements, and also tend to sort of interact with wild elephants or wild conspecifics within that area. And this is what you would generally see in your forest-based camps, zoos, and sometimes even private ownerships. On the other hand, intensive systems of management are kept in, the elephants here are kept in predominantly human-centric environments, which means in cities or towns, or even in small villages, and they are kept in enclosures, which are largely man-made. All of their biological and physical and physiological requirements are provided for by humans, which means that they're fed by humans. A lot of their activity and their movement is sort of constrained by the human sort of how they sort of want it to be done. And they are usually restricted to a certain area or chained to a particular location. And this is what you would predominantly see in zoos, circuses, temples, and private management. And I'm sure that all of you at some point in your time would have seen an elephant in captivity under each of these various settings. Now, this brings us to this very important question, going back to the previous definition that I was talking about of welfare. How would you define welfare for essentially a wild animal in a non-wild environment? So how can we ethically as humans, when we decide to keep elephants in captivity, provide for their requirements and beings as wild animals? And this is something that we then go back to looking at. So when you're looking at welfare of captive elephants, we need to be able to compare them with what we are seeing in wild populations as well. Now, just to sort of briefly give you how welfare is looked at for elephants in captivity, I took the liberty of sort of modifying this hierarchy of needs. And those of you who are familiar with psychology would probably know of Abraham's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where he basically says that all of us as beings, biological beings, have various needs and requirements. And if you look at the bottom of the pyramid, that is the most basic need that all of us have as individuals, as organisms. And that is, our biological needs for food, water, shelter, sleep, exercise, and physical environment. And as you grow higher, the needs become more specific with regard to the species. And like, for example, like social beings like humans and elephants, they also have these very fixed social and psychological needs where they need to be housed in groups, they need to have interactions with conspecifics, and need to have preferred associations with individuals. And then when it comes to, especially humans in captivity, there is this added component of human-elephant interactions, because elephants in captivity are assigned a particular individual or a mahout or an elephant keeper who is basically responsible for the elephant's well-being and upkeep. And that in itself also has certain welfare concerns, because if there are positive interactions, you are expected to have positive welfare. However, if the interaction between the mahout and the elephant is predominantly negative, then that again relates back to compromised welfare of the elephant. And then going one step further, you have these cognitive needs, where we all know that elephants are highly cognitive species. They have, sort of these huge repertoire of cognitive sort of, abilities that they have, and, which is in comparison to higher order beings such as humans and chimpanzees and apes and other marine sort of mammals. So looking at this is how I would like to see, if I were to look at elephant welfare, this is how in my head I envisioned how elephant welfare should be. Now, if you look at most of the studies that have been done in India with regard to captive elephant welfare, most of them have focused on biological needs, which is at the base of the pyramid. And this is very important because these are the basic requirements that we need to provide to all elephants that are in human care. However, we need to also, when we're looking at a complex species like the elephant, we also need to take into consideration these other aspects, which are social and physiological needs, their interactions with humans, and also, cognitive needs, because they are such cognitive and sentient beings. So keeping that in mind, this is, how we sort of designed our study, where we wanted to then therefore look at these various other aspects, which would then make for a more holistic understanding of how we were able to sort of provide good welfare for elephants in captivity. Um, so just sort of reiterating the point, just sort of bringing it all together, there are these various functions which are biological needs, psychological requirements, management and training, which brings in the human sort of impact. And then at the heart of it, where all three of these basic things combine, is when you would get adequate welfare, or good welfare that we could consider for elephants in captivity. So therefore, keeping this in mind, we chose Bannerghatta Biological Park. Now, Bannerghatta is like the national park. The biological park is also a very interesting sort of management system, because in the sense that it is an extensive management system, which means that elephants have access to natural forests, and for a large proportion of their time that they are managed in Bannerghatta, they are kept in this natural environment. And when we compared them to there was a study done by World Animal Protection Society, which looked at about 220 sites, tourist sites, which used elephants across Southeast Asia. When we compared that to the rating scale that was used by the World Animal Protection Society, we found that Bannerghatta scored a very high score of 9 out of 10, which basically meant that Bannerghatta was a very sort of a good landscape to be able to study how we could then compare elephants in captivity, but at the same time, they were allowed to have all of these natural environments that we also see with elephants in the wild. And going back again to that, the first definition that I shared, when we are looking at welfare of elephants in captivity, it is important to be able to compare them to elephants in the wild and then see whether all of those needs that we're seeing with wild elephants are being also met with captive elephants. So therefore, Bannerghatta Biological Park was chosen as our field study site. Um, so a little bit about Bannerghatta. I'm sure all of you living in Bangalore would have probably visited it at some point in time. So Bannerghatta is based in Bannerghatta National Park. If you look at the figure on the right-hand side, the figure in orange is what is Bannerghatta National Park, and the figure in blue is your Bannerghatta Biological Park. So Bannerghatta Biological Park is situated within the national park. Now, as a zoo, Bannerghatta is very interesting because it is very different from other zoos in the sense that because it is situated inside the national park, elephants have this very natural enclosure that they are, that they are used to. So during the day, they are housed in about 66.7 hectares of natural an enclosure, which is like a safari type thing. So visitors can come and see these elephants in this natural enclosure and have a safari-like experience. But in the evening, these elephants are let out into the natural forest to sort of free range and also interact with wild elephants found within the national park as well. And we assume, although we need to, of course, genetically test this, that all the births that happen in Bannerghatta Biological Park are a result of female captive elephants interacting with the male captive with the male wild elephants that are found inside the national park. The other very interesting thing about Bannerghatta is the social structure of elephants that are found there. Now, the biggest challenge when maintaining elephants in captivity is the social size or the social structure of the groups. Because elephants are such large animals, it becomes very difficult to manage them both financially, because there's a lot of financial commitment in terms of managing one elephant, and also in terms of controlling the safety of those handling them, because again, they are very large animals and because they are still considered wild to a very large extent. Secondly, giving them the space that is required for one elephant is again a big challenge, and therefore across settings, captive settings in India, you will find very small sort of these group sizes of elephants that are there because people just don't have the space to manage large group sizes of elephants. But in Bannerghatta, what was interesting was that we had about 20 elephants during our study period. And what was interesting about that was that these elephants were of different age group structures. So we had adult males, we have adult females, we had sub-adult females, we had juveniles, and then we also had calves. And this again is very interesting because again, when it comes to elephants in captivity, you mostly predominantly see only the adult classes predominating, the groups over there. But here in Bannerghatta, we have these 4 different age classes, which is what you would see within wild populations as well. And having these 4 different age classes is very important because elephants at the heart of it are a social species. So a lot of their learning, a lot of their interactions, a lot of their cognitive enrichments that they get come from these social interactions with individuals from different age classes. So having that within this captive environment of Bannerghatta was very important. And if you look at the age sex, the male-female ratio, it was about 1:2.3. And we took which meant that for every 1 adult male, we had about, 2.3 females that were there. And this is what we look at when it comes to sexual reproduction, and which is an important, again, concept for the biological requirements for elephants. And so what we did was, when we looked at the age sex, the sex ratio, we looked at males above the age of 15, and we looked at females above the age of 5. Now, females above the age of 5 were not considered adult females, but what happens in captivity is that because females, because of the high nutritional diet, they reach sexual maturation much faster, and we've been known to have females who've come into, who've had calves at the age of 6 and 7 years, which is not a good thing, because in the wild you would ideally see this happening with females at about 15 to about 20 years. But this is what we looked at when we looked at the sex ratio. The other interesting thing was the source of the elephants. Most of the elephants were born at Bannerghatta, and which was about 60%, and the rest 40% were distributed with wild caught females, wild rescues, and even temple rescues. This again becomes very interesting, because then this has an impact on how elephants interact with each other, and how they sort of tend to form sort of these preferred associations with individuals within the group. Now, like I said, about 60% of the individuals in Bannerghatta were related to each other. Now, if you look at the sort of the group on top, I don't know whether you can see my mouse moving, but this is all of the related individuals. And what is most interesting is that we have this hierarchy of individuals that are there. So it's like a multi-generational sort of system that we see, which again in captive environments is very, very rare to see, because usually because of the small groups, you don't tend to see these multi-generational things. And at the bottom, we had these group of non-related individuals that were brought in from different resources, sources, such as temple rescues, wild rescues, or wild caught elephants. And so the blue boxes were the males, and the green sort of circles are females, and each of their ages, you can see each of their ages also there within the figures. Now, the main aim of the study was basically, given that we had this so-called ideal environment which closely mimicked conditions that we would see in the wild, we wanted to try and pull out these various parameters that I had spoken about in the pyramid of needs, and try and see how we could then create sort of this holistic concept of welfare for elephants within this specific environment. And given that the Bannerghatta Biological Park was a very unique setting, we expected good welfare, which then could be used as a baseline for other systems of management, whether it was extensive or intensive in India. So the objectives of the study was basically to look at social organizations, because like I said, we had this very interesting multi-generational society that was there, with individuals from different sources being sort of forced to sort of interact together, and we were expecting to see some very interesting sort of patterns with that. We were also interested in seeing the behavior of the elephants. Are these elephants showing the behaviors of elephants that we would see with wild elephants? And also as a basic sort of a baseline study to also see the health of the elephants in terms of physiology. And we also had this added component where we did a questionnaire amongst the veterinarians at Bannerghatta Biological Park. And then we had this added component of mammoth-elephant interactions, which was done through questionnaires. However, for the scope of this presentation, since we have limited time, I will only be talking about social organization, behavior, and physiology. So the first component is social organization. Now, at the heart of elephant societies is this concept of sociality. And this is something that I cannot stress enough. Now, in the wild, elephants are found in these groups, which consist of genetically related females and their offspring within a sort of a matriarchal group structure. So you have a matriarch who is generally the oldest female at the head of this family structure, and then you have her daughters, her sisters, their female offspring, all within this sort of multi-generational system. Now, males are also found within the system, but they tend to, upon sexual maturation, which is about 12 to about 16 years of age, they tend to break away from these family groups and tend to become more independent and solitary. But they also tend to form, these group all-male sort of alliances, which are not as strong as you would, the associations are not as strong as you would see in your female groups, but they are more fluid, but they do also have these associations with each other. And then they tend to also interact with female groups, during the periods of sexual activity, or when they come into the period of musk. Now, while most social societies and social animals live in very stable groups, certain higher cognitive species such as humans, elephants, chimpanzees, and dolphins, they live in what we call as these fission fusion societies, where it is they do the structure does show a certain amount of stability, but it is also very fluid in the sense that it keeps changing, and this can change over time, or it can be change over because of certain factors such as resources, etc. So say for example, as humans, we are all, like if you take yourself individually, we do belong to a larger society, but within that society itself, sometimes we may tend to associate more with colleagues from work, or sometimes we tend to associate more with our family groups. So our sort of associations within individuals within our social structure also changes, and this is something that we also see in higher order mammals such as elephants and the great apes, and marine mammals such as dolphins as well. And this is a very interesting concept. Now, coming back to this concept of social organization, it is very important from a welfare perspective, because, like, once again, just reiterating the fact that a lot of learning takes place within these social organizations. So individuals learn how to know what food to eat, or where to go when resources are sort of scarce, how to mate, certain behaviors. So all of this they learn from being as a part of a group. And when it comes to welfare of animals, of elephants in captivity, again, the social organization becomes very important, because in zoos and in captive environments, there is a lot of transfers that take place between management systems, and therefore understanding the position of an individual in the group, his or her associations with other individuals becomes very important, because then this relates directly back to the welfare of that individual, as well as the larger sort of group context. Now, in order to understand the grouping patterns of elephants at BBP, because again, like I said, this was such an interesting sort of situation where we have this multi-generation system, but we also had these individuals from different sort of management systems that were being brought in. We wanted to see whether there was a subgrouping that was there within this larger group. So what we did was we had this sort of informal discussion with all of the mahouts there, because of course indigenous traditional knowledge is something that is very important especially when it comes to sort of forming these hypotheses when you're doing these studies. So we had this informal interaction with the mahouts at BBP, and they told us something very interesting, that they said that there were these three sort of subgroups that were operating within the larger population of BBP. So we had this green group, I don't know whether again you can see my mouse, so this green group which consisted of genetically related individuals, but then we had this pink group and this blue group which consisted of individuals that were genetically related but also were not. So they were these individuals that were brought in from different settings that were forming these groups with individuals from this genetically related group. And the males in yellow were sort of, they were solitary, or they had these temporal associations with each other. Now, in order to be able to test this, because this is again, from the mahouts and from their observations, but this is something that we actually had to scientifically test. What we did was we did a social network analysis. Now, basically what we did was that every evening the elephants would be let out into the national park to a free range. And the next morning, the mahouts would then go into the national park and retrieve them. They would follow these certain dung and drag chain signs. There were chains that were put on the elephants, and these form certain patterns. So these were the patterns that we followed when retrieving the elephants the next day, and also certain feeding signs. So once we came across a group of elephants, captive elephants, we took the GPS location, and we also made a note of the individuals that were present in that particular group. So this would give us information on who were the individuals that were associating with each other when they were given the freedom to do so. So because during the day they were forced to be in this safari enclosure, we were actually interested in seeing when they were given the freedom to sort of free range in the national park without any human constraints, who would they then prefer to associate with, and who would they want to associate with within the larger group. And we used a 500-meter marker. So this was basically individuals that were found within 500 meters of each other we considered as one particular group, and this was based on previous studies that were done in Asia. So we had a total of 125 field days with 225 observations, out of which we only took about 206 for analysis. Now, we then use this information to plot a social network analysis. Now, this graph looks a bit complicated, but I will use another graph to sort of explain the important findings. But I think what is important for you to take away from this graph is that we created an association index. Now, an association index is basically if the number of times individual A associates with individual B over the total number of times we found, over the total number of observations of individual A and individual B. So what we found with that data was there was a certain association index that existed between two pairs. So that was the important aspect that we took from this data. Now, what you are seeing in this graph is basically an association index. So these lines, the blue lines, actually show an association between individuals, and the thickness of the lines show the strength of the association. So, for example, if you look at individual 3 and 4, which was Ashwatthama and Gajendra, they were two males that were there. If you look at the line of association between them, it is quite thick. However, if you look at this is Gajendra, his interaction with Gayatri, who was an adult female. If you look at their strength of association, it is not as thick as it was between Gajendra and Ashwatthama. So the thickness of these lines indicated association strength of the individuals. And the distance between these two, so the boxes are basically individual. So the distance between the boxes are inversely proportional to the strength of the association. So the closer the association, the closer the boxes, the closer the association between individuals. So what we were seeing is that individuals, there were specific clusters that were being formed. So there were specific preferences that were formed between these individuals. So for example, there was a blue cluster, which again goes back to a particular group. And then you had this green cluster, which again goes back to the grouping that was sort of specified by the mahouts. And what was interesting is that even though this pink cluster was a subgroup that the mahouts had defined, we see them strongly associating with this green group as well. So going back to the fact that there is a lot of fission fusion that is happening within these groups. So it's a very fluid sort of a thing. But what is also interesting in the larger concept is that all of the females were interacting with each other. So there was this, again, fission fusion that was happening within the larger group itself. And the most interesting thing was the adult male, who was Bannerghatta depicted as one. He was predominantly solitary and he had very less associations with the rest of the group. So just to sort of put that in an easier context to understand, sorry. Okay. Just to sort of put that in an easier context to understand. So here we have Anuraja, who is the adult male. He was predominantly solitary and he didn't have too many interactions with these elephants. And this is something that you would also see in wild elephants as well. They only associated with female groups during mating. Then you had these two individuals who were Gajendra and Ashwathama, who were, Gajendra was a subadult male and Ashwathama was a juvenile male. And this was something, this interaction was something that was very interesting between them. So they had a very strong association between themselves. But what was interesting to note that Gajendra was actually a wild rescue. So he was an orphan calf that was brought into Bannerghatta. Now, he was actually using his association with Gajendra to gain access to these three groups. Now, Gajendra was genetically related to individual in all of these three groups. So he basically had access to females in all of these three groups. But what was Ashwathama doing was that through his association, peer association with Gajendra, he then had access to individuals in these three groups. And this was something that was similarly found in a study in Africa, where they found that often calves tend to associate with peers in the social organization to gain access to more influential adult individuals in the group. And they use this, and this was something important for orphan calves because it was critical for their survival. So because orphan calves were more prone to predation, they had limited resources to access to resources, and therefore by using their interactions with peers in the group, they were able to sort of gain that association with larger groups. And this is something that we also see in human societies as well. So say, for example, if we want to get a work done or a job done, we tend to ask somebody who knows somebody who's connected to somebody who we, who will be able to sort of get that done for us. And it's so interesting to see that elephants also have these strategies within their groups that they use to be able to get access to resources or to be able to protect themselves for their survival. The other interesting thing was that Vanita, who was, sorry, I didn't mention that before, but these orange lines basically are just connecting all of the genetically related individuals. So Gajendra was related to Vanashri, but Gajendra was actually Suvarna's calf. So basically all of these orange lines just show the genetic associations between individuals. So the other interesting thing that was found was that Vanita had a very high centrality score. So when I talk about centrality, it just means how influential this individual was within the group. Now, because of Vanita being part of group 2, her daughters were Nisarga and Rupa, who were part of group 3. Now, because of her specifically as an individual, group 2 had a lot of interactions with group 3. Similarly, Vanashri, who was the daughter of Suvarna, again had, who was part of group 1, again had that connection with group 2 as well. So as you can see, there were these various connections that were there, but even so, but we still were seeing these small subgroups that were there. And now coming back to Vanita, it brings back a very important point of welfare, because like I said before, that especially in captive environments, transfers between facilities are very common. And if you remove one critical key individual from that group, it could lead to, sort of compromised welfare for that particular individual and for other individuals in the population as well. So in conclusion, what was interesting about Bannerghatta is that we were seeing these matrilineal generational structures, which occur in the wild but were rarely seen in captivity. And even captive environments have, if given the freedom to do so, exhibit these complex social interactions that we also see with wild elephants, which have a direct impact and indirect impact on welfare. And there are these individual preferences. So even within groups, we had these, preferred associations. So within the group itself, you would see more associations between individuals as compared to other individuals. And definitely a lot more research needs to be done for the reasons of this, whether it is personality or individual traits of the elephant, whether there were certain management settings that were sort of coming into play, um, or whether there were other influences such as the presence of calves that were sort of influencing these fine scale groupings that we were seeing. We also need to look at a long-term analysis of social networks, and taking into consideration the life histories or backgrounds of individuals. And also, more importantly, we also need to see how much of is the resident male contributing to the population. Because Bannerghatta, who was the adult male, was rarely seen with the females during free ranging. And this possibly also could have been because the females were generally interacting with wild males during this particular period, which probably kept Bannerghatta away from interacting with the female populations. But it is also interesting to note as to how much is he genetically contributing to the population, and is he sort of fulfilling the function of a male within the population itself. And of course, looking at more fine scale information on interactions within daytime enclosures as well. The other bit that we looked at was behaviors, and this we looked at through time activity budgets. Now, behaviors is something that is very crucial to understand, especially when it comes to trying to understand as to what elephants want in captivity. So a captive environment should be able to promote species-specific behaviors, and also be able to reduce, stress-inducing behaviors or certain stereotypic or normal behaviors that we largely see with elephants in captivity. Now, while elephants show a wide range of behaviors which focus on, hygiene, self-grooming, or biological or social requirements, and therefore studying these activity patterns, how much of these behaviors are they exhibiting during the day, and what is the range of these behaviors is also important when it comes to looking at understanding welfare of elephants in captivity. So since this was the first time that we were doing a study in Bannerghatta, we weren't sure of the range of behaviors that we would see. So we did a sort of an limited sampling at the beginning before we actually started collecting the data to see what was the range of behaviors that we were sort of observing in this population. So we found 8 different types of behaviors, and these are behaviors that you would also see in wild elephants as well. So most of these are self-explanatory: bathing, drinking, play, sleeping, sexual response, meeting, and dust bath. And the only additional thing that we saw with elephants in captivity is this concept of stall feeding. So while elephants were given grass to feed on throughout the day, and this was something that they could have done at their own free time, and they have the freedom to do so. There was this concept of stall feeding, which was basically elephants being fed by humans at a particular nutritionist food. So this was something that these behaviors, like I said, were sort of seen in wild elephants as well. And what we did during this period is that we looked at all of the individuals in the population, and we then basically looked at these specific behaviors that they were exhibiting, and the duration of the time, and the day or the time of the day in which they were sort of exhibiting these behaviors. So what we found was elephants were predominantly engaged in feeding for about 32 or 33% of the time. This was followed by sleeping and bathing and as well. This again is what you would predominantly see in the wild, where elephants spend about 60% of their time feeding, and then the rest of the time they would engage in all of these other grooming activities. Um, this is just a time activity budget to show you the time of the day where we saw certain behaviors peaking. So say, for example, feeding, usually happened during the time of 10 to 11, and then started decreasing by the afternoon hours. Again, this was because grass was usually sort of kept for elephants during this particular time. But what we were also seeing, like activities such as sleeping, you would see a peak in the afternoon, which is again the hottest part of the days, where wild elephants usually take shade from the sun, and this is when they would be found to be sleeping the most. Um, and also other activities like dust bath, or which again sort of helps them regulate their body temperatures, is again seen during the hotter part of the day. So this time activity budget closely resembles the sort of time activity budget that you would see for elephants in the wild, which then sort of gave us this understanding that these elephants, when they had the natural environment, when they had the freedom and the physical environment to engage in these activities, would closely mimic the kind of behaviors that you would see for elephants in the wild as well. So in conclusion, elephants were spending a large proportion of their time doing what elephants in the wild also sort of exhibit. And given the choice, like I said, they were engaging in species-specific behavior. But what was worrying is that in Bannerghatta, elephants spent a large majority of their time engaging in self-directed or self-maintenance behaviors, which is what you don't see in the wild. And we need to explore this further, whether this was resulting because there was nothing else for them to do when they were kept in these enclosures. And of course, when they were free ranging, we also need to look at certain behaviors like vigilance and defensive behaviors, which was something that we did not cover during that particular time. The other thing that we looked at was body condition scores. Now, the if you look at the body of an individual, that would give you a direct estimate as to the health of an individual. And body condition scores is important to sort of physically and quickly assess how an elephant is doing. And one of the biggest challenges with elephants in captivity, because of the high nutritional diet, is the fact of obesity. And obesity, again, because of lack of exercise, high nutritional diet, elephants tend to put on a lot of weight, and this is a huge concern medically for elephants in captivity. So what we did for body condition scores, we took a 11-point rating scale adapted from Weber and Krishnamurthy, where we looked at 6 different parts of an elephant's body. So if you would look at these points, we looked at the head, we looked at the scapula, which is, whether there was enough of flesh that was showing between the shoulder blades, the flank of the animal, again, whether, there was a depression before the pelvic bones, the lumbar vertebrae to show as to how much of the spinal column is visible, and also the pelvic bone to see how much of the pelvic bone is visible again. And these again this rating scale was done and is being used throughout on wild elephants as well as captive elephants as well. Now, what we did was we took 4 photographs of the elephant. So this is Shivu. So this is just to show you that we took the left lateral, a right lateral, a posterior view, and the anterior view of the elephant to be able to sort of score them on these 6 different parameters. And basically the scoring of the elephant on this 11-point scale was, if they received a score of 0 to 5, they were found to be with poor body conditions. If they received a score of 6 to 8, that was optimum, which meant that they showed good body condition, and 9 to 11 was obese. So if you look at the individual on the left, that's Menka. She has a score of about 8, which is on the higher end of a good body condition. But if you look at Lily, to be politically correct, she is quite healthy looking, and she received a score of 11. So you can actually see the difference between these two elephants. What we also did is, because life histories such as mass pregnancies alter the body condition scores of individuals. If we found that an individual was going through a particular life event, take for example Veda, she was pregnant at the time of the study. So what we did was, what we took photographs of her before her pregnancy, during her pregnancy, and after her pregnancy, and then we sort of averaged that out to give her an average score during. So you can actually see the difference before, 2 months before she gave birth. You can see this, her pelvic bone is more prominent, but after giving birth, probably because of the nutritional diet, this is something, the pelvic bone is absent. So that's, we averaged it out. So if you look at the group as a large, about 60% of them actually fell above the optimum body condition score, showing that elephants in Bannerghatta were found to be on the slightly heavier side, and only about 40% were found to be between that optimum level of 6 to 8. And this is again something that is concerning, because given the fact that these elephants are allowed to free range, they're allowed to move in the evenings in the forest, we were still seeing this, slight obesity within the population, which was not something that is good. And this again, needs to be then looked at when looking at the larger concept of welfare for these elephants. So in conclusion, like I said, about 60% fell above the optimum body condition score, showing poor welfare. And we also found a correlation between the body condition score and age, which was something that was an interesting finding, because this is again something that you would see in the wild, where individuals tend to peak or show a good body condition score at the ages of about 40 years old. So this was something that we were seeing in these captive populations as well, and something which is quite different to other captive populations, where adults tend to show, especially if you look at temple elephants or other intensive systems of management, elephants tend to show poor body condition scores as well. So in conclusion, just looking at the study as a whole, like I said, we wanted to look at a holistic study that would understand or would take into different aspects of the welfare of captive elephants, and not just the basic biological or physiological needs. So there are these various aspects, such as psychology, the biological needs, social needs, which all form very individual important aspects of welfare. But coming together, they need to have this larger concept of welfare, when if we are to sort of ethically sort of provide this environment for elephants in captivity. So extensive systems offer a sort of better comparison, where we're looking at other systems of management, and we can use these as a comparative system. But of course, this is by no means a holistic study. There are definitely more things that we need to look at, especially with regard to the Bannerghatta population, to try and get more information on providing that optimum welfare for elephants. So in conclusion, I would like to thank and acknowledge these particular individuals. Of course, Avinash and Dilip, who are hopefully here in the talk today, they were part of the study, and they conducted the study with me. I'd like to thank our chairman, Reverend Prem Mitra, without whom the study would not have been possible, and of course, for his guidance throughout the project. Also, Surendra Verma, whose inputs and advice on the subject and on certain aspects of the study were very critical. The veterinary doctors at Bannerghatta, Dr. Nirupama and Vaseem, the Mahouts at Bannerghatta, and last but not least, all of the captive elephants who sort of made the study so interesting and worthwhile. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and thank you for listening to my talk.
Thank you so much, Sagarika. Thank you so much for such detailed, your research that you shared with us and the conclusion. I hope this study was used or is being used by the zoo authorities to look into how they could better the welfare of the captive elephants at the zoo.
Yes, so basically a formal report has been submitted to them, and with all of our recommendations and all of our the insights that we got from this study has been given to them.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So now let's open the forum for the audience to ask questions. We have some questions in the chat box, but if somebody wants to ask the question directly, please go ahead. Please state your name before you start asking, just so that we all know who is asking the question.
Yes, ma'am. My name is Gautam.
Hi,
Yes,
Gautam.
I have a question. Are captive elephants lost to the ecosystem or the forest?
Sorry, Gautam, could you repeat that?
Captive elephants are lost to the ecosystem or forest.
They're lost to the ecosystem?
Yes, ma'am.
So it is a very interesting question because if we were to sort of consider captive elephants as essentially wild elephants, you would assume that they would sort of contribute in some way to the ecological functioning of forest. However, this is something that we still do not know in terms of what is the role that they play, especially when they're free ranging, with regard to how do they change habitats, what impact do they have with interactions with wild elephants, and how do they alter their landscapes that they are found in. So unfortunately, I probably don't have a very direct answer with regard to that, but it is an important question to look at in that sense, because if we are still considering them as wild animals and them performing all of these functions or all of these behaviors that we would see as wild animals, we could possibly expect them to have some sort of impact on the ecosystem. But I'm not quite sure as to, again, what that impact is at this particular point in time.
All right, can I ask the next question?
Another 15 minutes, I think.
Yes, please. May I know who is asking?
Yes, this is Kedar Kulkarni.
Yes, sure, Mr. Kedar. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kedar Kulkarni. I'm delighted to have seen this talk advertised on a friend's Facebook page, and I just happened to be at the point where I could have attended. So thank you so much for this talk. I was wondering if I asked a question in the chat window, and the question I had is, I have two questions. One, is there a good ethnography of mahouts that you can recommend? Because I've been searching for one, and what I keep on finding are either newspaper articles, which is great, because at least they're current and based on interviews, or kind of very quasi-historical, kind of interpretive, poetic sources, but nothing like a good ethnography. And number two, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned this citation by this fellow named A.J. Ferrier, I think. Can you please go back to that so I can write that down about domestication, because I missed that part for my internet leaked out, unfortunately.
So I mean, I could just share that on the chat, and then you
Awesome.
sort of take that. So I think it was AJ Ferrier. It was in 1972, I think so. But just to sort of reconfirm that, I'm just going to put that on the chat. But coming to your first question, there are a lot of actually ethnographic studies that have been done in Southeast Asia. So I know Piers Locke has done a study with mahouts and elephants in Nepal. I also know Paul Kiel, who has done some work again in Southeast Asia. So there are a lot of people who've done these ethnographic works with mahouts and elephants in Asia. But specifically to India, I don't think I think there was something that was done in Assam,
Okay.
if I'm
Yeah.
not mistaken. But yeah, so these are some of the important works that have been done with captive elephants and mahouts and ethnographic studies.
Okay.
So
Thank you so much. I'm sure if I may email you later, that would be lovely. I don't mean to
sure,
hog too much time on this chat right now.
sure. I
Okay.
could just share my email and then on the chat, and then if
Yeah.
anyone has any further questions, we could just drop.
That would be lovely. I'd be happy to email you, and I can introduce myself further and better in the email.
Definitely, it'd be great to hear from you.
Yeah. Thank you, Kedar. Thank you so much. Anyone else would like to ask the next question? Or I can take the one that came on the chat. Okay, this question came from Chandana P. Sagarika, and the question is there any sort of tension observed when the captive female meets a wild male?
So thank you, Chandana. I mean, that's very interesting question. And what we actually found was, so Bannerghatta Biological Park is situated within the in the northern bit of Bannerghatta National Park, and in the northern bit of Bannerghatta National Park, we actually find more wild male elephants when we did our camera trap studies. So the frequency of finding more male elephants on our camera traps was higher as compared to the female elephants. So the wild males were using this part of the park a lot more than the females, and this was possibly because wild males have a lesser ecological requirement than females, and they can survive in predominantly degraded habitats, which was what the northern bit of Bannerghatta was, because it's so close to the city of Bangalore and it has all of these anthropogenic influences that are there as well. So we found a lot of interactions happening between the captive females and the wild males. And like I said, we suspect that a lot of births that have happened in the zoo, the Bannerghatta elephants, are caused because of the wild males. And what we would find is that during free ranging, a lot of times wild males would be found associated with the females, and a lot of times when the females were brought back to the zoo or brought back to the safari enclosure, the males would also sort of come along with females. So we saw a lot of these interactions that were there, but we didn't really go into detail in terms of looking at classifying it, whether they were agnostic behaviors or whether they were positive interactions that we were seeing. But there were a lot of these range of interactions that we were seeing between these wild males and captive females, and we largely suspect these interactions to be quite positive. We also found during our study period, we had this wild juvenile subadult male who was actually found to be associating with the captive females for a month. And Philip and Avinash will also tell you about that male. It was so interesting because he was within the captive enclosure with the captive elephants, and he would also sometimes eat the food that was given to the captive females that were there. And this was a very interesting point because, like I said, I don't know whether you remember that this is generally the time that the male elephants tend to move away from their natal or family groups and tend to start associating with other female groups and gain that little bit of independence. So here was this wild male that actually found the comfort or found this female captive elephant group that he was predominantly associating with, and then use that to sort of break away from his natal group. So I don't know whether that answered your question, but it was the interaction that we saw between the females, the captive females, and the males were definitely very interesting. So
Yeah. Thank you, Sagarika, for answering that in detail. One other question that came it's basically based on the diagram that you showed us, the association between different elephants, the relationship and the thickness of the association was by the how thick the
Yes.
lines were.
Yes.
So there was the Vanraj, who you did mention that he was a wild elephant, so he didn't have many association with others. And that is the question: why Vanraj is shown to have no connection with other elephants?
Sorry, I don't know whether I mentioned the word wild, but Vanraj was actually a captive
Oh,
elephant,
okay.
but he was the adult captive elephant that was there. And so therefore, like I said, because he had, it wasn't that he had absolutely no associations, he had very few associations with these female groups. But this again relating back to wild elephant behavior, where wild adults are mostly solitary. Sorry, wild males are mostly solitary in nature, but then tend to interact with female groups during sexual activity or mating or when they're in.
Okay, all right. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Yeah. If not, then I will take the next question from the chat window. It says, what kind of stereotypical behavior do elephants exhibit in extensive management system?
So again, that is a very interesting question. And so our study was for 1 year, and within that 1 year, we didn't notice any stereotypic behavior that was there amongst the population. The only time that we actually noticed any stereotypic behavior was when an individual called Lakshmi, she was separated from the group and was put in with Sundar, who was a temple rescue that was brought in from Maharashtra. And so to give Sundar company, Lakshmi was sort of put in with him because Lakshmi was known to have a more gregarious personality. So it was believed that she would sort of help him transition much better. So the only time that we actually saw any stereotypic behavior was with Lakshmi, because she was separated from her group, from her subgroup, and from the larger female population. And that was the only time that we actually saw any stereotypic behavior amongst the individuals at Bannerghatta. So largely in extensive systems of management, you will rarely see stereotypic behavior because of all of these, this physical environment that is being provided to these elephants, where they have the freedom of choice, they have the freedom of movement, they have the freedom to engage in these complex elephant-related behaviors that then prevents them from, becoming bored or, having these high stressful situations, which then is what actually causes the stereotypic behaviors that you will see in captive elephants.
Yeah, that question was from Mr. Srinu Shrikanta Maharana. I hope that answers his question. Anyone else would like to ask before we conclude this talk? Sagrik, I was just curious, you mentioned about the stall feeding, which when we visit the zoo, we see this often happening. And you said it's not something that should be done. So, I mean, I don't know if it should be done or it should be discouraged, or why do we do it then?
So it's not something I don't, sorry, I don't know whether I said that it shouldn't
No,
be
you didn't
done.
say it should not be done. I think it's not something that would come under there, a good welfare.
Yeah, so that relates back to actually the problem of obesity that we see. So the
Right.
problem with stall feeding is that stall feeding happens in bulk, which means that elephants are given food at one particular time, and then these are again highly nutritious foods, and high in starch content, high in protein and sugar, and therefore it happens at once. Now if you look at elephants in the wild, they spend about 60 to about 70% actually actively looking for food, manipulating their food,
Mhm.
finding their food, moving from place to place to get that food. So a large portion of their day is engaged in feeding. Now, what happens in comparison and captivity, when you just give that food at one shot to the elephant, you have this whole period of time during the day where they have absolutely nothing to do.
Nothing to do.
And they have absolutely nothing to sort of engage them in. So from that concept, you need to be able to sort of space out the kind of behaviors that they are doing in captivity so that they closely mimic what we actually also see in the wild. So, give them food to manipulate, which is why grass is such a good thing, because, they spend time breaking it, they spend time hitting it on their legs, they spend time, sort of putting it in their mouth. So then that sort of, covers a large proportion of their time in captivity where they're engaged in something. Because if they're not engaged in something, then that leads to boredom, which then leads to a lot of other abnormal behaviors that we see with elephants in captivity.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I think just now one question came from Chanda again. Chanda, would you like to ask that question yourself, or should I take it from the chat?
Yeah, I was putting it in the chat because my internet connection is a little shaky. So you can go ahead and.
Okay. So here, what she's asking, Sagarika, is that you had mentioned in your slides that the social structure is different from what is observed in wild. Does that affect the daily interaction between the captive individuals?
So I think it is very, very important because we have this large chunk of information that we have about um, social organizations and structures with wild elephants, but there is very little information that we have about captive elephants. And as far as I know, the study that we did in Bannerghatta was actually the first study in India to use this concept of social network analysis, where we went into detail to try and find out what were the associations between individuals in the group. So right now, it like you said, that it is assumed to have some sort of impact, and like I said, this is something that I cannot really comment on because we only looked at associations during free ranging. We did not look at associations or interactions when they were in the daytime structure or the safari structure, which then would have given us more fine scale information. But from basic observations that we made during the presentation or during the study, what we did notice is that yes, daily interactions could have an impact on the welfare of captive elephants because there were certain dominant individuals within the group. So for example, Lily, the elephant that was, shown, who was quite a large female, she was we found from our preliminary observations that she was a very dominant individual. And a lot of times when she was feeding or she came to an area where others were feeding, the others would tend to sort of move away. So we didn't collect fine scale information about this. These are the only observations that we observed. But it can be assumed that the daily interactions between the individuals could have an impact on the type of interactions that we're seeing and also the welfare of elephants within the daytime enclosure as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Sagarika. Channa, I hope that answered your question.
That does. Thank you very much.
Okay, the last question is there a Mahout training center in India? I feel a good Mahout has to be trained well to understand elephants and their behavior. This is what Ajit Katte wants to know, if there is a Mahout training center in India.
I would definitely like one to be because I think the system of Mahoutship is sort of changing very drastically. So most of the Mahouts about 90% of the Mahouts that were there in Bannerghatta all belong to this tribal community of Jain Kurugras, which are traditional elephant keeping tribes. However, when we did this questionnaire, one of the questions that we asked them was that would they like to see their children become Mahouts, because in Asia and Southeast Asia, the profession of Mahoutship is a traditional system. So knowledge transfer is passed on from one generation to the next. And all of them said that they do not want their children to become mahouts because there are a lot of risks associated with the job. There are a lot of difficulties that are associated. So therefore, we expect the system of mahoutship to change. We expect more inexperienced mahouts to come in, which then has a direct impact on the welfare. While there isn't specifically a training center, Avinash has done programs in South India, which basically looked at various, calling in different mahouts from various forest camps across Karnataka. And there was a training that was done. So it's these small individual trainings that are being done, but I don't think, as per my knowledge, I don't think we don't have this specific training center where we have this exchange of knowledge from mahouts from the south to the north to the east, and central India as well. So.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Sagarika. Thank you for answering all the questions in detail. I would now call Sonal, a member of Bangaloreans for Bannerghatta, to give the vote of thanks. Sonal, over to you.
Thank you, Sana. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so it was a very interesting webinar, Sagarika, especially the social structure of the elephants and the interaction in a group and the social network analysis which you shared. It's so similar to us humans, and it's so surprising and something which we all can relate to. Is the Maslow's hierarchy. We study that in order to manage people in IT industry, to understand their needs. So the surprising part is this is not only applicable to us humans, but also the elephants. And so I would say that this helps us to understand why we need to get involved in elephant welfare. So thank you, Sagarika, for your time to share your insights on elephant captivity and the welfare. I thank Arosha India for the continuous support to Bangaloreans for Bannerghatta. I also thank all the participants here, all the listeners for their time on this Sunday morning to take interest in understanding elephants and their welfare. And lastly, all the volunteers for Bangaloreans for Bannerghatta for your efforts in organizing such webinars. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sonal. Thank you so much. Yeah, Sagarika, thank you again. We like to see your PhD and maybe have you more in our discussions. And I hope all the zoo, your PhD would be related more than the biological park, I'm assuming.
Yes, so I would be looking again at very similar extensive systems of management, but probably across Southeast Asia.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone, again. Do tune in to our next webinar, which will take place on next Sunday. We will be soon sending the details about the guest and the topic of discussion. Thank you again and hope to see you next Sunday. Thank you. Thank you all. Bye. Bye.